Hello, and welcome back to Words That Burn, the podcast taking a closer look at poetry. This week I'm joined by Cork poet Maurice Riordan, who's here to discuss a brand new collection of his selected poems from Faber and Faber. Those poems were selected by Jack Underwood, a former student of Maurice Riordan and a poet in his own right. The poems are presented within this collection out of chronology, which means that they are free to focus on many of the things that hold Maurice Riordan's attention. Maurice joins me today to take a look back at that career and how his themes have evolved, changed and developed over the years. Hi Maurice, how's it going?
Thank you, Ben. I'm doing okay. Doing okay for the moment.
For the moment. It's always for the moment. So, selected poems is a unique achievement. It's quite a bit of work in one selected volume. When you were reading back through this, having a look over it, did you notice any kind of patterns or changes or alterations in your own style that surprised you at all over the years? Or
I can't say I was actually surprised. I mean, the selection disengages the poems from the individual collections and comes up with kind of a new arrangement of. So, actually, there was a bit of relief that didn't result in very jarring kind of transitions and so on. So just, I guess, tracking my own development as I would sit back through the books. There was quite a lot of domestic stuff early on. And that's gone, but not completely disappeared, I realized. And then also, I suppose, the poems tend towards being speculative or metaphysical, let's use that word. But I realized, okay, so that was there in my first published book as well. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I often thought, I don't know which book I'm in terms of the selection. And then, I did notice perhaps that the selection did perhaps do things so that the poems that maybe felt a bit older sort of disappeared into the trees, as it were.
your own themes seem to crop up a little bit more when they're out of chronology, if you like. So these poems were chosen by Jack Underwood, poet in his own right and a former student of yours, I think, based on the introduction here.
Yeah. 25 years ago, yes.
Yeah. And he said that it was a very conscious choice to take them out of chronology and layer them in this way. But a lot of your recurrent themes become a little bit more apparent, I think, in that wash of your work. You have, as you said, a lot of domestic poems, a lot of rural life poems, and focusing in on that kind of thing. I'm very drawn to the way in which you contrast a very insistent modernity into a life that feels a million years ago, especially when it's rural Ireland or something like that. I wonder, have you always had that fascination when it comes to watching the clash of the modern and the old come together?
Oh, yeah, very interesting, actually. Yeah. Okay, so the oldest poem that Jack put in there is called Rural Electrification, 1956. And that poem, I don't know why he chose that one, but that one happens to be about 40 years old. And that was interesting. When I was looking at the proofs, I thought, okay, was this a kind of unconscious sort of response to Seamus Heaney's digging? Because it's a kind of a digging poem in
Yeah,
its own
absolutely.
sort of way. Except it's also the kind of advent of, electrification, rural electrification. But that kind of caught a moment. You see, I was born really into, you could say, candlelit horse-drawn work, yeah? Unbelievably long ago, really. A kind of almost mythic time. But the thing about it is it changed, really, when I was about 3 years old or 4. Everything began to change, and by the time I was a teenager, we were watching the World Cup and Madame Bovary on television. Another rural electrification that was. And I caught this sense of accelerated change early on. And as a small boy, anyway, of course, that's thrilling, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess it's also kind of something that's alarming. And that's the way it's gone, really, throughout my life. Things changing. And so I mean, psychologically, you can't rest or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
All right, I'll read this then. Rural Electrification, 1956. We woke to the clink of crowbars and the smell of creosote along the road. Stripped to his breeches, our poleman tossed up red dirt as we watched him sink past his knees, past his navel. Another day, he called out to us, and I'll be through to Australia. Later, we brought him a whiskey bottle, tucked inside a Wellington sock and filled with tea. He sat on the verge and told of years in London, how he'd come home more fool to share in the good times, and went on to describe AC, DC, ohms, insulation, potential difference, so that the lights of Piccadilly were swaying among the lamps of fuchsia before he disappeared into the earth.
Perfect.
Okay. I haven't read that aloud for, well, not maybe 35 years. so I think, yeah, okay, I like polarity anyway. I think my
Yeah.
brain is drawn to that. So that polarity, extreme polarity, really, between having one foot almost in the 19th century, as it were,
Sure.
and the rest of me in a very kind of modernistic, dismaying, exciting, overcrowded world. So those kind of things in play with each other, I think, is something that's maybe characteristic. Yeah.
An overcrowded world is a nice way of phrasing how it comes across in a lot of your work. Absolutely. So time seems to be a big thing that comes through in your poetry, and you said yourself that this metaphysical kind of sense of things comes into your work sometimes. I'm fascinated by two poems in particular. One of them is The Flight, and the other one is Lull, or The Lull, sorry.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever resonated so much with an image in my own head as when you described the smack of the ball on the tarmac in the Lull, how it hits the ground.
Oh, yeah.
And I just remember it jumped out at me, and I was like, I know that sound is seared into my own brain. I found it really interesting because it froze me in the poem, probably the way you intended, because I went back in my own head and went, geez, I remember hearing that all the time outside the door. But there's a real, I suppose, bleeding together of times in The Flight, and then there's a real standstill in the Lull. And I wonder if you experience those moments and then document them later, or if you're just generally drawn to this idea of wanting to slow everything down to a bit of a halt as you go.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that poems are very effective ways of controlling, manipulating time, as it were. Yeah, yeah. And I think we borrow a lot of the, if you like, techniques from film, but also I think maybe the way of thinking is so influenced at this stage. So I definitely think of myself as somebody who exploits those kind of possibilities. Now, I will say about The Flight, I don't know whether it's, well, it is, I think, isn't it? It's actually the way everything gets jumbled in a dream. It's a dream poem. So yeah, the way your brain jumps around in different times, and people are alive, and there are all the weird things that happen. So there's that. The lull is probably, yeah, it's just, usually things do have a kind of basis in experience, don't they? So just those moments when you think, okay, time, you're on your own, it's quiet, time has stopped, maybe, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
That was Donny, is it, of the poem. And then actually, okay, this might be interesting. I was actually, when I wrote it, I was in Paris at the time, but I was watching old films, and there's one by René Clair, but it's about this magic ray that stops time in Paris.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's quite a short film, and I think that kind of said, okay, let me try this. Just use this kind of technique in the poem, stop everything, see how everything looks if it stops. And that led to some kind of interesting images, like, I don't know, the shoal of herring, yeah? They look like, I don't know, they look like a sort of sculpture or something if you just stop them. A few images like that. So, yeah, I was just doing that kind of pause, start again kind of button kind of thing. The lull. It happened on the cinder path between the playing field and the graveyard one afternoon in October, when all the leaves of the aspen flipped over and stayed, the way a skirt might blow up and hold in a gust of wind. Except there was no wind. One of those days when the thud of a football hangs in the deadened air. But there was no thud, no sound from man or bird. So I'd swear if I'd looked at my watch just then, the digits would have stuck, if I could have looked. For it must have been a time when time was snagged in its fluid escapement, and in that lull no one can enter the world or leave it. The cars stand on the motorway, the greyhound's legs are knotted above the track, a missile is framed in mid-flight. No sound comes from the child's mouth, the open beak, and the shoal of herring is a sculpted cloud, shimmering under the glass of the rolling downs. At this moment, when the joker palms the room key, the punching fist can be opened, the egg slipped back under the nesting bird, and each of us could scurry to forestall one mischance or undo one wrong choice, whose thorn of consequence has lodged till now, before whatever it is keeps the world scary and true breaks loose. A squirrel turns tail overhead, a chestnut rolls to the ground, and with it a drawn-out scream arrives from childhood. Sounded okay, did it?
That was perfect.
Yeah. And then, yeah, as poems do, they surprise you in the end. In the end, you get this kind of scream out of childhood, yeah, which surprised me. And then I thought, okay, later, that's probably an Elizabeth Bishop short story called, I think it might even be called The Scream, yeah. But it was just something that the poem kind of seized in the moment, if you put it like that. Did I answer your question there, Ben?
Yeah, no, I think that was pretty effective. I like that idea of your process being a bit more of a meander than a straight line towards something in particular.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really do think poems, well, of course, I'm not alone in this. Robert Frost's poems are dynamical things. They're like, I don't know, he didn't use this analogy, but it's like a chemical reaction or a crystal being formed or something like that. You have a feeling that something is happening, but you don't strictly control it, yeah?
Yeah,
That's how
absolutely.
I experience it anyway, yeah.
So you mentioned a few times there about movies and how poetry has probably been influenced by that kind of idea. There's quite often a really strong narrative drive in some of your poetry. The one I think that I won't ever forget reading is Timeout. Timeout is simultaneously beautifully observed but horrific. You want it to stop. At least for me, in my
Yeah,
experience, I wanted the poem to stop about 3 or 4 times. I was like, okay, that's enough. That's enough. But
okay,
it's incredibly cinematic. It's
yeah.
very compelling. And you're driven to the end of it. You can almost play that movie in your head. I'm wondering how much cinema impacts you. You seem to be a fan of it from the few answers there.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, I think I do even mention Hitchcock, reference him in
Hmm.
Time Out towards the end. Gives the game away a bit. It's about cranking up the fear, the terror, and
Yeah.
so on. And so it also comes to me, if you like, bounces off fiction. I remember at the time I was reading Ian McEwan. Well, I was particularly reading The Child in Time, where I don't know if you know the plot of it, but a child is lost, I think, in a supermarket at the beginning. But you know anyway how McEwan terrifies the life out of you to begin with. So I wrote it actually very quickly. I mean, I don't usually write poems very quickly, but I did write that one very quickly, half asleep kind of thing. Just was playing out in my head, just like almost a waking dream or something like that. So, but definitely, I think I was holding on to that kind of filmic narrative. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Tolkien, if you like, or Ian McEwan, if you like. Just don't worry about anything else. Just keep it going.
Just keep mounting it up. Just
Yeah,
keep mounting it up. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, it's incredibly effective in that particular poem. But as I said, I couldn't stop reading it. I wanted to once or twice. I was like, oh, this is going to
Mm.
devastate me by the end here. But I suppose it wouldn't work if your talent or your skill for imagery wasn't there. I think you have a real way of creating a succinct and relatable image. And I don't want to blow too much smoke, but you create a really relatable image. It's something that someone can connect very easily. I find quite often in some poetry, the images will either hit or miss depending on your own experience of things. But I think you create images that almost nearly always hit. The one that sticks out to me quite a bit is in Gone with the Wind, where you're trying to recall the name of the actress who plays Catherine O'Hara. I read this once. I'm just going to pull it up here so I don't misquote you. Yeah, so he said, first I felt the shadow of a bird across a lawn, a hint at how her name would sound. And I thought that was the greatest way of encapsulating that tip of your tongue irritation where it's just out of reach. You spoke a little bit about how you surprise yourself with some images in poetry. Have you always been drawn to really strong imagery in poems, or is this something you developed over time?
Yeah, I mean, like you, I think you were suggesting you're sometimes left a little bit annoyed by poems because they're not vivid enough. I would say, like, it would be almost axiomatic for me that I'm visualizing the poem as I'm writing it. Sometimes, hopefully, getting it a little bit, I don't know, surreal or a bit blurry or something like that. But definitely, visualization is very much, I mean, I do think of poems as sort of occupying fictional space and like a very good, I don't know, very Ian McEwan, let's say, but lots of very good prose writers. They like, I mean, one of the things they do is they keep it visual, yeah. And then the others, in a way, the other stuff has to slot in there, I think, yeah.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, with the one you're mentioning, Gone with the Wind, I think, I don't know, there are kind of, the poem might be, what shall I say, playing with the idea, okay, like, who was Scarlett O'Hara?
Yeah. Sure.
How much of an answer it is to say Vivian Lee was, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The names are very, what should I say, problematic or whatever it is. We don't quite, we're facile with the way we treat them and so on. So those things might be going on, but definitely trying to capture. Yeah, I would have been quite pleased with the shadow of the bird across a lawn. Yeah, yeah, and how that
I'd
would.
say you were, yeah. I'd be pretty pleased if I came up with that one myself. Yeah, no, it's a joy to read a lot of the images in your poetry. I know you spoke a little bit there about keeping it visual, but I know you also, and you spoke about it a little bit at the start there, the influence of the domestic in what you're doing. You have a very good way of making an image relatable, but you also observe some really subtle moments of pure humanity. And what I mean by that, without getting too grand, is there are little actions that every human does that they don't necessarily observe in the moment, but it just slides by. And the one I'm thinking of in particular that jumped out to me in this collection was, I cannot remember the poem, and this is very bad interviewing etiquette, but it's the one where you mutter under your breath about some young person being an arsehole. I think
Uh,
it's, I'll
okay,
find it
it's
here.
called, what's it called again? Is it called Habits?
Old Habits is what it's
Old
called. Yeah,
Habits,
you're
yeah,
spot
yeah,
on. Old
yeah,
Habits.
yeah.
I think that poem in particular has a lovely sense of observation to it. And I again read it and went, "Oh yeah, I've sat there and called someone an arsehole under my breath." But I wonder, like, do you reflect on this as you're writing the poems? Do these observations come to you? Do you make a note of them when they come to you in the moment, or is it again a surprising journey for yourself as much as it is?
Yeah, well, I guess it helps that if you're the kind of person who has muttered under your breath like that many times. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm not much of a note taker, really. The point, and what tends to happen is, I mean, there are exceptions like Timeout, which came out quite quickly, but generally, I just have some very vague idea. And then, I don't know, I think, okay, yeah, something might happen here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but it's just something that happens over the page or nowadays more over the screen, really. Yeah, so with that one, I don't remember really. I mean, I would say that I'm quite happy to make things up. There would be things, and even a simple poem like that would just be fictional details I'd make up to make the overall effect work. And I often maybe keep the poem quite, not always, but often keep the poem quite simple. Yeah. Well, I used to anyway, early on, tell myself, make it obvious. Yeah. Make,
That's very interesting.
yeah, and let the kind of, I don't know, the resonance or the depth or the other meanings take care of themselves, and not to let go the kind of four square, plain outline of the poem.
Yeah.
So that's something that I do. I think it's something I find in other poets too. I mean, I don't think I've invented the wheel here, but I do. I'm quite consistent with myself about that, actually. Yeah.
Oh, I'm surprised to hear that. I quite often hear about poets lashing themselves for being too obvious, but I think I wouldn't say you ever make it too obvious to the reader what you're writing about. I think you strike a very fine balance between abstract and concrete, if you want to look at it that way. But it's interesting to hear that you, I suppose, keep yourself to such a discipline of no, keep it understandable, keep it focused, as it were, as a
Yeah.
poem.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a particularly disciplined thing. It's just it's probably the way I need it to be,
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I suppose that is a lot of talk about the domestic, but I'd be a bit remiss here looking at your selected poems not to ask you about your love affair with nature and when that started and what draws you back to it all the time. There's so many wonderful poems
Okay,
focused on
yeah,
it.
yeah. I mean, isn't everybody?
In my head, I'd like to believe that, but I don't know if they are.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I suppose. Okay, so I don't know. I mean, I okay. So I did an anthology many years ago with Scottish poet John Burnside, and he was very, shall I say, passionate about this. He regarded it as intelligent that one was connected with the world that is not us. And yeah, I think probably do feel that. Maybe not to as passionately he does, but I don't know. I mean, I feel. I mean, I feel deprived without more living things around me, as it were.
Sure.
Yeah, not human beings now. I don't mind that.
Them you could take or
But
leave.
more, I'd like to live in a more creaturely world than I do here in London. But I think it's a very kind of, yeah, I think I do feel a deep kind of connection with the natural world, and I feel bound by it. That this is it. Like I was thinking actually today about Yeats's poem. I was going to say, do you know it? But of course you do, Sailing to Byzantium,
Yeah.
which ends up with him becoming a kind of a golden bird. Once out of nature, he's going to become this golden bird. And I thought, no, what are you going on about? That is an alternative view of life, to want to get away from it, as it were, to get away.
Yeah.
Whereas I would definitely be more the kind of person who is tends to more connection to the snails and the worms and the fish in the pond, just generally living things around me. Yeah.
Yeah. You capture them wonderfully. There's quite a few gorgeous poems in there that kind of they're the nest is one, or the nests
Oh yeah.
is one that I was particularly drawn to. It's almost scientific in its cataloging of the different birds and how they put it together, but again, wonderfully observed and just there's a kind of a real reverence that comes through in the poem itself for that kind of thing. But I like that you talked about you want to be more part of it, but you also, I don't think, would give up the human side. And there's a lovely interplay between those birds making a nest and then the speaker and their object of affection making their own kind of nest and shelter from the world. I think you interplay those things beautifully.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't always know myself quite. I'm quite, I don't know, passive about my poems. I think when you're writing them, you're serving the poem as best you can. But I think there are things about your poems that you just don't, and there might be obvious things that you're not terribly aware of. I just think, well, my job is over, I think. So
Sure.
whatever people feel or don't feel, unfortunately, you can't control their,
No,
their
no.
negative feelings about them either. Yeah.
Definitely not. Definitely not. Do you think you'd write if you didn't have an audience? Would you keep it up?
Who says I have an audience?
Well, there's a selected poem sitting in front of me, so we'll say for the sake of
Okay.
argument, you have an audience.
I think so. I couldn't be absolutely sure of that. It would be very dispiriting, wouldn't it, if
Yeah.
if you had no reflection back at you, no kind of bounce back at you. On the other hand, like, okay, there are times when you do have a sense of an audience, when you're in front of an audience reading and so on. But mostly you just do have to do this kind of in a very kind of, well, not isolated, but fairly secluded sort of world. Yeah. And nowadays, anyway, I don't have. I have my partner. She will look at my poems, but I don't. Like in the old days, I used to go to workshops and things like that, so I had more of a kind of a landing ground from my poems, but I don't have that anymore. So it's a bit of a solitary sort of activity.
Sure.
Sad to say.
Sure.
Would I keep at it? I think so. I think I would
actually
keep at it. Yeah, yeah.
That's good. So you get something out of it anyway, other than just writing down beautiful things.
Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, no, I would not like. It's a drug, like, yeah. I mean, for me, it's one I can't indulge in every day, unfortunately. But when a poem comes right or something like that, just opened a bottle of wine straight away, kind of thing. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm struck there. You said you went to workshops when you were younger, and you had that communal sense. I find in a lot of your poetry, there's a real harken back to older Irish customs in terms of communal storytelling, and you yourself wrote about the early Irish lyric and that kind of thing, and Irish mythology crops up all the time in your work. I'm fascinated by that. I'm particularly interested in, I suppose, if you think it's important to make sure that those kind of older Irish traditions are kept going, and why you think it's important that happens.
Okay. Well, I confess, I have done an anthology of the early Irish stuff and done some translations and so on. Now, I think, okay, so but I'm not a lot of Irish writers have been very programmatic about, I don't know, retrieval or revival or something like that, yeah? And I don't really see it like that because, well, for one thing, I think we are very remote, genetically probably, and also certainly culturally from people who wrote stuff over 1,000 years ago. Yeah, over 1,000 years ago. At the same time, in Ireland, we're very good. I mean, I've got a niece, she's called Grania, and I've got a grandson now, and he's called Finn.
Very good.
So at least nominally, we seem, as Irish people seem to, I don't know, cherish or maintain this connection to these kind of, I don't know, really quite remote ancestors now. But maybe that's what a culture is. Maybe there is a kind of, it occurs to me there might really be a kind of sense of cultural community in Ireland that extends over time that's maybe a bit unusual. Maybe the Greeks have it, but I'm sure there are lots of cultures have it, but certainly Irish people seem to. Well, we still play hurling.
Yeah, absolutely. It's lasted this long.
Because Cullen was whacking heads of warriors through the fields or something like that. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's a kind of an interesting thing, maybe. But what I resist, though, is the idea that, like, this is some kind of that we really do connect with these ancestors, as it were. I don't see it like that. But still, there is something. And, okay, so I actually even still find the Irish landscape haunted. Yeah. Now, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether this is to do with the famine and all the people that died, or whether... But certainly in my head, mythically, as it were, it feels like it's more ancient than that we do. That there is the Firbulg or whatever are still
absolutely still wandering around.
Are still there somewhere with a bit of a hold on us. So I mean, and then there's just, I suppose, who's going to care for this stuff if we don't? You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So then, I don't know. Does that answer your question there, Ben?
It does indeed. It does indeed. I was struck by that in Badb. Now, I may have mispronounced that because I'm never sure what way different people pronounce this one, but Bav or Badb, it's the trio goddess from Maca and the Morrigan there.
I say Bav myself. Yeah.
Okay, Bav it is. We'll go with Bav for this. So in this, but I was so struck by that kind of really foreboding feeling in Badb, as if the landscape was judging you almost, or telling you don't really belong here in the same way. I found that really interesting.
That was one of those kind of things that actually happened, the encounter thing with the crow when I was a teenager, I think. And it did scare me a bit, just seeing this crow make this expression. And then I was actually asked to write, well, along with other people, asked to write a poem for Ted Hughes, his 65th birthday.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, so I thought, yeah, this was the chance to compare my crow to his crow, as it were. My crow
Job well
better than
done.
your crow.
Your crow is certainly scarier than his crow. I'll give you that.
And I thought actually he would appreciate it. He'd kind of like this BADB when he'd think, oh yeah, I know who she is kind of thing. You know?
Yeah, there's definitely a good resonance there of Irish mythology that it connect with people, I think. Another one that just tying in with what you said about Ireland being a slightly more haunted landscape and that notion is the changeling.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I've rarely seen a poem written from the perspective of the changeling, but I thought it, and you can correct me if I've misinterpreted this, I thought it was a nice way of showing an outsider status in a rural community that isn't necessarily a creature of myth, but maybe someone who doesn't fit in with the society around them in the same way. I was particularly taken with that first stanza where it talks about all the places it hides and spends time away from other people. Do you think alienation is a part of your work, or isolation might be a better way of putting it? And if so, why do you think that is?
Well, big Dr. Ben.
sorry.
I think I was drawing on a sense of isolation or difference, I suppose. That I had. How it's not unusual, isn't it? How did I end up in this family?
Absolutely.
Yeah, much as I love them,
Absolutely.
but
Yeah.
And so yes, and my sister, a very nice woman, but very nice child too. She used to call me a shifra, and that is actually I think I wrote the poem under the title Shifra, which is the Irish for changeling. But then I thought, that would be a bit challenging maybe for a lot of people. It would be an obfuscation or something like that. It was, the poem definitely draws on the sense isolation, I think, and maybe that as something that's embedded in my life, even though or in my psyche or whatever. Yeah.
So, Shifra would be a unique one to put to a more global audience, I suppose. Even an Irish audience, I think, would struggle with Shifra as well.
Well, it was a call, really. I regretted it because, I didn't know. I thought, okay, so somebody's going to have to look it up, or too many people are going to have to look it up. And that's a little bit of a barrier, unnecessary barrier. So, whereas changeling, everybody knows what that is,
Yeah. So, I suppose that brings me to a poem that I found both very vivid, but also very abstract in equal measure. And that's a word from the Loki, which I found really interesting. So it's about a given word that essentially shapes reality in some form. But I was curious for you, when it comes to, because that collection, I suppose, A Word from the Loki, is a London-based collection. You're a Cork man yourself. I was wondering how spending time both in London and Cork has affected how you write and influenced the way that you speak or use your own language.
Good question, yeah. Not one I have actually, surprise, I haven't really thought about it. Okay, so I come from a little place in County Cork called Lisgould, so I think probably it's been part of my almost all my adult life now, having this kind of polarity again, London and Lisgould, and my dream life gets them completely interwoven in ways that's sometimes bizarre, sometimes amusing. So it probably does, what shall I say, it's a kind of, or has become anyway, a comfortable fit for me to have this kind of little country place, as it was back in the 1950s anyway, and this center of the universe place,
Yeah, absolutely.
as a kind of polarity in my life, so that I'm not, I guess I might be somebody who doesn't like to be too loyal, as it were,
Okay, yeah.
I keep a foot in the enemy camp.
That's an excellent answer. That'll be all. I won't push you further on that, so you'll incriminate yourself. That's perfect as an answer. Again, I'd be a little bit remiss if I didn't touch on one of your last, what seems to be great loves in poetry, which is science. Because you've edited a few collections specifically around scientific poetry and things like that, and it definitely crops up again and again. But I'm wondering, is it the polarity that you enjoy that drew you to science as a concept, or has it always drawn you in? And how does it feel to work that into poetry?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, yeah. Well, again, I suppose there is a polarity. We'll come to that. But I think one of the things that I use kind of science for is a kind of observational tool. You know what I mean? A kind of way of looking at things accurately, objectively. Now, I wouldn't be the first person, obviously, to do that. Elizabeth Bishop, I always felt, had that kind of tendency. She would probably relate it more to being a visual artist as well as being a poet. But I think for me, that kind of, I don't know, observational thing and that kind of check on it, as it were. Yeah? Is that really what we're seeing, what's there, and so on. So I think that just fits very well with other things we've talked about, the visual, I don't know, maybe a degree of objectivity, of coolness about the writing.
Yeah.
So I think it fits in quite well with that. On the other hand, I really am one of those people who thinks there's more things in heaven and earth than Horatio than is dreamt of in your philosophy, or however exactly it goes. So I'm certainly skeptical about science in all sorts of ways, yeah. And I'm also have a kind of yearning, at least anyway, for something transcendent, yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I haven't completely, I suppose, discounted the possibility of that. I certainly think there's something about life, yeah, that's, I don't know. I don't mean immortality now, but that there is something about it that is, I don't know, just completely mysterious. And you can use the word spiritual if you want, yeah. And like the bodies we go around and are definitely, I don't know, dualistic. I don't know if they're dualistic, but there's definitely something more to us than the blood and guts.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well,
Do you think a lot of your writing is a pursuit of that, or trying to find that transcendence or that
it's, well,
dualism?
maybe not, but trying to, yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, I think just, yeah, I mean, it's a way of just singing or dancing or saying there is more to it than just the utilitarian. There's more to it than going to the doctor's surgery and having MRIs and all those kind of things, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Maurice Riordan, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to come and have a chat with me this evening. It's been a pleasure to go through your selected poems, and it's been a pleasure to chat with you here.
And thank you, Ben. I've learned a few things about myself in the course of the interview.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it. Thanks a million again, Maurice. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
That was my interview with Cork poet Maurice Riordan. I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I want to take this moment to thank Maurice for coming on and being so generous with his answers, and I'd like to encourage you to pick up that collection of selected poems wherever you get your poetry books. It's out now from Faber and Faber. I'd also like to give kudos to Jack Underwood, who did a phenomenal job of choosing the poems and putting them together in a sequence that really lets Maurice Riordan's talents, themes and preoccupations shine. If you enjoyed this podcast, I do regular interviews with various poets, and I also do close reading of poetry at least once a month. If you enjoyed it and you'd like to hear more, consider subscribing to the podcast wherever you listen, be it on Spotify, Acast, Apple Podcasts, or somewhere else. If you enjoyed this episode in particular, please consider giving the podcast a review, as it really does help me to get the podcast out to more people. And if you enjoyed this conversation in general and you think you know someone else who might as well, send it on to them, please. That would be fantastic. If you'd like to read the transcript for this interview, you can find it at the Substack link below in the description. And if you'd like to keep up to date with more poetry content, from quotes to analysis to interesting poems, follow Words That Burn on various social media platforms. You'll find a link to the Instagram, the TikTok, the Blue Sky account, and the Threads account of this podcast down below. Words That Burn is written and produced by me, Benjamin Colopy, and I'd like to take the time to thank you very much for listening.